to ways to follow our call to love. Please be seated. Has anyone here suffered a sore back? Sounds like it has. I've recently known several people who've suffered back injuries that have rendered them unable to stand up straight or sit comfortably. Imagine not being able to sit comfortably. It dramatically limits what one's able to do and also one's perspective on the world. In today's gospel story, Jesus sees a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. We could call her Eileen. She's lurking at the edge of the crowd. And Jesus calls her over, lays his hands on her, and she's enabled to stand up straight. Healing is good. But here, it's not the end of the story. The leader of the synagogue objects because according to him, Jesus has contravened the rules about keeping the Sabbath. And more than that, he's trying to stir up the congregation against Jesus' actions. Jesus calls him out. He calls them hypocrites and points out, don't each of you free your ox or donkey from the manger on the Sabbath and let them have a drink? And he asks them, shouldn't this woman, a daughter of Sarah and Abraham, whom the Satan has bound for 18 long years, be freed from this bondage on the Sabbath? Jesus is pointing those in the synagogue beyond the rules to the purpose of the Sabbath. A day of rest for the well-being of the community. Also a reminder of their corporate history that they were set free from slavery. So the purpose of the Sabbath is to help individuals and community thrive. And in the Bible, the Sabbath is extended to the concept of the seventh year as a Sabbath year. And the 7 times 7th year is a jubilee when land rests, enslaved are free, and debts are canceled. And as it happens, this is a jubilee year. And if you want to know more about it, go on the website of the ecumenical group Kairos. But today's story is pointing out that anything that diminishes health is a perverse parody of the purpose of the regulation. Like withholding food from the hungry in the name of righteousness, to harken back to last week's readings. In naming hypocrisy of the leaders here, Jesus is acting in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. In our first reading this morning, we heard the call on the poet-prophet Jeremiah. That sent me back to looking at my favorite Hebrew scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who died earlier this year, but thanks to YouTube. YouTube can hear him. Brueggemann tells us that the prophetic imagination exposes God's world as it is. Playfully and openly, often using art, poetry, or drama, the prophet convicts the hearers not to accommodate what they see, but to envision a different world, as God would have it. The passage preceding the one that we heard this morning situates Jeremiah at the time when the elite of Jerusalem were being taken into exile in Babylon around 587 before the Common Era. Jeremiah is a descendant of priests. And these elite royalty priests, scholars in exile in Babylon, are forced to reflect on their history and what went wrong in their relationship with the God with whom they were in relationship, in covenant. The defeat by the Babylonians had come after a series of kings, some who were considered good and some who were considered not good or evil and oppressive. And having looked back on their oral history, the exiles compiled what we now know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. In today's reading, we hear the credentialing of Jeremiah, to whom in the previous passage the word of the Lord had come. With a series of action verbs, we heard, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Jeremiah initially resists this call, arguing that he's too young and he can't speak well. God counters, telling him not to be afraid, for I have appointed and empowered you to be a prophet to the nations. What followed are more action verbs in poetic speech. Among them, I have appointed you to pluck up and pull down, to build and to plant. Plucking up and pulling down involves exposing truth, defining traumas, and often speaking truth to those in power, sometimes through dramatic action. And if you read on in Jeremiah, you will see that God has him putting on a linen loincloth, going down to the potter's house, buying a piece of land, all dramatically to tell his story. Now today, there are no end of truths that need telling. With Jesus, we need not only to support the healing of those who have been marginalized, but also to critique those systems and habits, both in our church life and in the wider community, that get in the way of healing and abundant life. James Cone, the late Methodist minister and Black theologian, has written, "The Christian community is that community that freely becomes oppressed because they know that Jesus himself has defined humanity's liberation in the context of what happens to the little ones. Christians join the cause of the oppressed in the fight for justice, not because of some philosophical principle of the good or because of a religious feeling of sympathy for people in prison. Sympathy does not change the structures of injustice," he writes. "The authentic identity of Christians with the poor is found in the claim which the Jesus encounter lays on us, on their own lifestyle, a claim that connects the word Christian with the liberation of the poor. Christians fight not for humanity in general, but for themselves and out of their love for concrete human beings." That's the end of the quote. Jesus reached out to the bent-over woman. He saw her need and responded with compassionate action. His action on the Sabbath led him to speak truth to his critics. In Jeremiah's language, plucking up their false piety and pulling down rules that got in the way of compassionate action. The question for us today is, who are the I-leads, the bent-over ones in our community? What do we have to build and plant to restore them to full life? Just a few suggestions. Today, we have the opportunity in our city to stand with the LGBTQ plus community in the Pride festivities. There are also asylum seekers waiting too long for a hearing or to be reunited with their family members. There are migrant workers who toil in fields picking fruit and vegetables that we enjoy, who have less services and legal protection than the rest of us. There are also people languishing on the streets after the closure of safe injection sites. And in an initiative which this church is already involved in, there are students new to the city who could use a friendly hand and a welcome. I believe that in the weeks and months ahead, we will be considering the issues around us and what our appropriate response should be. What are we called? To pluck up